Chair, and first of all, thanks to Deputy Casey for the introduction of the bill, and also to Minister of State English for what I accept is his genuine commitment to introduce the amendments to deal with the issue. First of all, the issue of overcrowding in our housing stock is a very significant issue, and it's important to acknowledge that it's now 2 years since the RTE Investigates Nightmare to Rent documentary showed some of the most appalling overcrowding that many of us have seen for a long time. It is important to acknowledge, however, that that kind of overcrowding is not the most common, and nor is it the kind of overcrowding, or exclusively the kind of overcrowding, that this bill is clearly trying to address. And it's important to reflect for a moment on the kinds of overcrowding that we deal with every day. We have a very, very large number of local authority houses where you have 3 and in some cases 4 generations of the one family living in exceptionally cramped circumstances. And that's because of, over many, many years, a lack of supply of social housing and a lack of other available housing options. So it is not uncommon in my own constituency, as I'm sure it is in other deputies' constituencies, for 2 adults and 2 children to be living in that box bedroom, often 7, 8 or 9 square metres, and living there for very extended periods of time. And it's not just that it's cramped, it's actually unhealthy and unsafe in terms of condensation, in terms of damp and impacts on the respiratory well-being of the tenants, in addition to the enormous stress and strain it puts on family relationships. I can think of one family in my own constituency where you ended up having 10 adults over 3 generations living in a standard 3-bedroom 1980s local authority house, and that was not unusual and not exceptional. We also have a very significant amount of overcrowding where people are sleeping on their extended family members' couches, often talked about as hidden homelessness or sofa surfing, but simply where people can't get accommodation and the extended family doesn't have that additional box bedroom, and that adds to significant issues as well. One of the things I've started to notice more recently in the private rental sector is multiple families renting private homes, and these people aren't even eligible for social housing support. Often people with relatively decent incomes, but because of the very high price of rental accommodation, both in our city centre and the suburbs here in Dublin, you can have 2 professional working families with children renting a house that was only intended for 1. And in fact, I can list a number of cases where in fact you have 3 extended families forced to share simply because of the cost of rental accommodation, with all of the difficulties that involves. And we also have a lot of older single men, many of whom may have separated or divorced and left the family home to the wife and children, sometimes with alcohol addiction issues or mental health issues, living in very unsanitary and overcrowded, almost kind of like flop house accommodation, which also raises issues. So if we're going to design not only a new definition but a new enforcement regime, it has to ensure that we capture all of that to ensure that those people don't continue to live indefinitely in really what are appalling housing conditions. I absolutely share and support the intention of the bill, and therefore we would have been supporting the bill notwithstanding the government's amendment, but given that the government's amendment has been supported by the proposers and given that we accept the intention of the Minister, we're happy to endorse that as well. And maybe the comments I'll make in the last few minutes I have are as much with a mind to influencing the debate around those amendments, because ultimately that's where this is going to go. I have to say I do agree with Minister English in terms of some of the comments he made on the technical outworkings of what's proposed in front of us, and I think any definition has to be run against and assessed against our building standards and the technical guidance documents that come with the department. Our design standards, and particularly the design standards that have been recently introduced, albeit with a lot of criticism from people like myself and others, for apartments and studio apartments and co-living. They need to be run very closely against the minimum standards for the private rental sector, but also the design standards for local authority housing, and the Minister alluded to this. But for example, in some cases, some of the floor area per person in page 4 of the bill, table 2, either A, would require a change in the design standards for local authority housing, or could actually result in housing that's currently under construction falling foul of the new standards, and we have to work all of that out. We also need to look very carefully at the enforcement, because one of the difficulties with the current enforcement regime is not only that there aren't an adequate level of inspections, and that the sanctions are too weak. But sanctions actually don't come in once the offence is identified. In fact, people in breach of the existing standards are given a period of time to rectify those. So even, for example, the very serious situation in the properties identified in Nightmare to Rent and RT Investigates 2 years ago, my understanding of the existing legislation is those landlords would be given a period of time to rectify that before facing any sanction, which seems to me an appalling state of affairs. I mean, if we're saying there are standards, and if a serious breach of those standards is an offence, then you shouldn't be given a period of time to rectify it. There should be an immediate sanction followed up by the opportunity to rectify before further sanction. I do want to express a concern. I know the government does have a target of 2020 or 2021 where there will be 25% inspections of all private rental properties. On the basis of the latest NOAC figures, we're not going to reach that. And whether that's a lack of funding being provided by the department and the minister, or whether it's the failure of local authorities to employ the staff or get the inspections up and running, we need to have that 25% of inspections, and I think we need it much sooner than the 2021 deadline, because if we spend a lot of time putting a new definition in on statute and we're not doing the inspections, and some local authorities are still only inspecting 5 or 10% of the rental properties, others are doing much better, but it means that all of our work will have been in vain. The other crucial thing, of course, is if we introduce new standards and we have a better inspection enforcement regime, then the question has to be asked, so where do people go? So that family, for example, that I'm thinking about at the moment, where you have two families living in private rental property in my own constituency that's designed only for a family, a standard family of 2 adults and 2 children, and we actually have 4 adults and 6 children. Where are those families going to go? Where are the properties going to be, either on the social housing side, the affordable housing side, or the affordable rental side? And therefore, what we need to see is where new standards are introduced, and I think they should be ambitious standards. We need a parallel assessment of how many properties that's going to affect and what the lead-in time is for the enforcement of those, because what we can't do is force people into homelessness because of a lack of available alternative housing options on the social, affordable or private end as a result of the new standards. The converse of that, however, is we should not allow the poor supply of housing to lower our expectations in terms of what the standards should be. And therefore, I'm not in any way arguing that we shouldn't have the highest possible standards. In fact, the very opposite. It's that in parallel with those standards, I think we need to be far more ambitious in terms of the delivery of social and affordable housing that's required. So what I will say is this, we're happy to work both with the proposers of the bill and with the Minister and Committee to get this right. I think particularly at committee there are a range of voices and experts in this field who we'd like to hear from. So let's do this in a way, as we did with student accommodation, for example, where we get it right, where we work together and we ensure that in this instance people in any kind of housing have sets of standards which ensure a good quality of life, and an inspection regime that identifies those properties that fall foul, an enforcement regime that ensures that these standards are upheld, and crucially a much more ambitious supply of social housing, of affordable rental and purchase, as well as straight private housing, so that all people into the immediate future can have the expectation to live in good quality accommodation which meets their needs at an appropriate and affordable price. Thank you, Chair.
So again, looking forward to working with colleagues on this in the months ahead as well, as is Minister Murphy bringing forward the legislation as well. I want to thank the colleagues for the views on the proposed bill and their comments on the issues raised. And I think we all acknowledge there are overcrowding. There's different stats out there in different situations, but we all know as we knock on doors as we go along, we meet people and people come to us who are in overcrowded situations, which we don't want to continue with. And that's why when we do allocate social housing, it's off the social housing waiting list. And that's why people often ask us, well, if we have 10,000 houses, why don't you give the 10,000 to everyone who's actually without a house? But we have to work off a list there of people in the right order, and we try to do that where we can as well. Because there are many people who are in overcrowded situations who are substandard accommodation waiting for a new social house. So I'm glad this year we will be in a position where, and again from all the meetings of the local authorities in the last couple of weeks, we will be at a space at about 10,000, 200 or 300 houses into the system, which will help make a difference to bring some relief to many families who are waiting for housing as well. But we need to continue doing that. As well as all this sector as well in the years ahead too. But I just want to touch on what is coming in supply. Just in relation to the current inspection powers, and that if there's a time delay there, If the owner of a house is causing or permitting the house to be overcrowded, the local authority can require the owner to desist from causing or permitting such overcrowding within a period not exceeding 21 days. So that's what they have, 21 days to rectify that, which is kind of normal enough in most cases with standards. Certainly we see it with the health sector as well. You know, if there's an inspection, you're given a little bit of time. Maybe some might think 21 days is too long, but certainly if it's urgent, I think there's different powers there from the Fire Service Authority, but certainly from inspections from an overcrowding point of view, that's generally what's accepted there as well. But the local authority can serve notice to the owner of the house, specifying the maximum number of persons that may occupy the house without causing overcrowding. So they do, and they can act quite fast as well. But again, under the Fire Service Act 81/2003, there is an option to prohibit occupation of premises to which Part 3 of the Act applies where necessary in serious cases. And they do use those powers, I believe, and have used them as well. But that's not to say we can't strengthen it as well, just to bring a bit of strength in there as well. So rather than going back into the things we're all kind of in general agreement here, we need to act on this. We'll leave it at that for now till we're here again in the months ahead.
Thank you, Minister.